Good evening. Welcome back. Or, if this is your first night here, welcome. This is the sleepy history of medicine. Long, quiet documentaries about how human beings have tried to heal each other, told slowly, in the dark, at the pace of a fireside story. You don't need to do anything for the next 2 hours except listen or not listen. Nothing important will happen. Nothing will be on the test. If you fall asleep somewhere between medieval London and the soda fountain, you'll have used this exactly as directed. Tonight's subject is not a disease or a cure or a famous doctor. It's a room. Picture it at closing time. The lamps are low, the walls are shelves, and the shelves are jars. Hundreds of them, glazed and gleaming, each with a little painted label in abbreviated Latin that promises order in a disorderly world. There are drawers below, small and square and dovetailed, each holding one dried thing. A root, a bark, a petal, a salt. There's a workbench, scarred and stained, with a brass scale that will settle an argument to within a grain. And there's a mortar and pestle. There's always a mortar and pestle, worn smooth in exactly the places where 4,000 years of thumbs have held it. This room has had many names. The House of Life in Egypt, the Saydala in Baghdad, the Apothecaries shop in London, the corner drugstore in 1,000 American towns, and whatever your own pharmacy is called, down the street with its fluorescent light and its person in a white coat who knows your name and your allergies. It is all one room. It has been continuously open somewhere on Earth for about 4,000 years, and tonight, slowly, shelf by shelf, we're going to walk through it. So settle in. Let your shoulders sink into the mattress. The door is unlocked. The bell above it is about to ring, and there is no hurry at all. There never is, in a well-run shop at closing time. Chapter 1. The First Druggists. The oldest prescriptions on Earth are pressed into a piece of clay about the size of your hand. It was found at Nippur, in what is now Iraq, and it was written by a Sumerian physician, or perhaps for one, a little over 4,000 years ago, in the neat, wedge-shaped strokes of cuneiform. On it are roughly a dozen remedies. They call for things a modern herbalist would recognize immediately: myrtle and thyme, willow and fig, pear and fir resin, salt and saltpeter, pounded, infused, strained, mixed in a beer or smeared on with oil. The instructions are practical and calm. Pulverize, pour, wash the affected part, bind on as a poultice. And here's the detail that historians of pharmacy find endlessly, affectionately maddening. The tablet never says what any of it is for. No diseases are named. No doses are given. Whoever wrote it assumed the reader already knew. the way a family recipe card says, "Bake until done," and trust you to be someone's grandchild. The oldest pharmacy document in existence is not a textbook. It's a colleague's note. Medicine, from the very first line we have of it, was already a profession talking quietly to itself. Whether the person who pounded those remedies was a pharmacist is a fair question, and the honest answer is not yet. For most of the ancient world, the healer and the medicine maker were the same tired person. But the bench already existed. The mortar, the sieve, the measuring vessel, the fire. And benches have a way of collecting specialists. You can see it most clearly in Egypt. Egyptian medicine, which we visited in our first episode, ran on remedies. Hundreds upon hundreds of them in the papyri, honey and willow and poppy and, yes, the occasional crocodile dropping. Somebody had to make all of that. In the temple complexes, there were rooms the Egyptians called, beautifully, houses of life, part library, part school, part workshop, where texts were copied and preparations were prepared. The papyri themselves speak of gatherers of herbs and preparers of remedies, people whose job was not the bedside but the pshur. The prescriptions even carry little instructions we'd recognize from a modern label. Take with sweet beer. Take for 4 days, because honey and beer were the original vehicles, the spoonful of sugar 3,000 years before the song, there to carry the bitter thing and make it stay down. The masterpiece of the Egyptian bench was a preparation called kaifi. It was an incense and a medicine and a nightcap, all at once, a compound of a dozen or more ingredients, wine and honey and raisins, myrrh and juniper, cinnamon, sweet flag, resins whose names we're still not sure how to translate. The recipe was important enough to be carved into temple walls at Edfu and Philae, which is a wonderful thing to consider. A drug formula deemed worthy of stone. Kaifi was burned in the temples in the evening as the day wound down. The smoke was said to ease anxiety and invite sleep. The priests who blended it, measuring resins by lamplight to a recipe carved in granite, were doing recognizable pharmacy. Standard formula, careful compounding, quality control by the gods themselves. And the product, fittingly for us, was rest. The Greeks, who inherited all of this and argued with most of it, gave the whole enterprise its name, and in their way, its warning label. The word is pharmakon. It is the root of pharmacy, pharmacist, pharmacology, and in Greek it means at the same time remedy and poison, not one or the other, both in a single word, on purpose. A pharmakon was any substance with the power to change a body, and the Greeks declined to pretend that power only pointed one direction. Everything on tonight's shelves, the willow bark, the poppy juice, the bitter fever bark waiting a few chapters ahead, obeys that word. The difference between medicine and poison, as we said more than once in our last episode, has never been the substance. It has always been the dose, the aim, and the honesty. The Greeks simply filed that truth inside the word itself, where no one could lose it. Their medicine makers were already specializing too. There were the rhizotomoi, the root cutters, Professional gatherers who knew which hillside, which season, which moon, and, just as importantly, which plants would kill you in the gathering. And there were the pharmacopoeia, the drug sellers, who kept stalls in the marketplace and enjoyed roughly the reputation that word suggests. Respectable physicians sniffed at them in writing, at length, which tells you two things: that some of them were surely frauds, and that all of them were doing brisk business. The tension between the counter and the consulting room, between the person who sells the remedy and the person who prescribes it, is as old as the professions themselves. We will watch them quarrel, politely and otherwise, for the next 2,000 years. But before we leave the ancient bench, spend a moment with its one immortal tool. The mortar and pestle appears in Egyptian tomb paintings. It is implied in the Sumerian tablet's very first instruction: pulverize. It sat on the counter in Baghdad, in the monastery still room, in the London shop, in the American drugstore. It is stamped on pharmacy signs and printed on pharmacy licenses to this day. And there is very likely one within 30 feet of your own pharmacist right now, kept partly for use and partly the way a family keeps a grandmother's rolling pin. 4,000 years of medicine. And the technology at the absolute center of it is a heavy cup and a blunt stick. Nearly everything else in this story will change. The theories, the ingredients, the buildings, the licenses. The grinding of one thing into another, patiently, until it is fine enough to do its work. That never has. There are worse emblems for a profession. Take something hard and make it something a person can swallow. The ancient bench had its tools then, and its recipes, and its first quiet professionals. What it did not yet have was wealth. That arrives in the next chapter, because somewhere between Sumer and Rome, the ingredients themselves became treasure. Resins worth their weight in silver, roots that launched trade routes, and one celebrated plant so valuable and so impossible to farm that the ancient world simply used it up, all of it, to the last stalk. The first drug shortage in recorded history is still going on. Chapter 2: The Price of Spice. Before medicine had science, it had shipping. This is easy to forget, standing in the quiet of the shop. But every jar on those shelves arrived from somewhere, and for most of history, somewhere was astonishingly far away. The remedies of a Roman pharmacy, or a medieval one, or a Victorian one, were a map of the known world in powdered form. Bark from one continent, resin from another, roots from a third, all of it carried by camel and ship and riverboat into that one small room. The pharmacy was globalized before almost anything else on earth. And that is because, for thousands of years, drugs were not merely valuable, they were treasure. Consider frankincense and myrrh. the two scented resins that a certain famous story ranks alongside gold, which was not poetic exaggeration, but a fair market appraisal. Both are the hardened sap of scrubby, unglamorous trees that grow stubbornly in one corner of the world, southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa. Both were medicines as much as perfumes, myrrh especially, packed into wounds, mixed into salves, prescribed for everything from sore mouths to embalming, which is one way of saying it accompanied you from the cradle to considerably past the grave. Whole trade routes existed to move them, the incense roads, camel caravans padding north through the desert, tolls collected at every oasis, prices doubling with each middleman. The Roman writer Pliny, who complained magnificently about nearly everything, complained that Rome's appetite for incense and Eastern remedies was draining the empire of silver, an ancient economist scolding an ancient trade deficit over drugs. Pepper, plain black pepper, the stuff in the shaker, was medicine too. A heating drug in the old humoral logic, prescribed for coughs and cold stomachs, and so valuable that it was counted out in individual peppercorns for taxes and dowries. There's a story, told for 16 centuries, that when Alaric the Goth held Rome to ransom, his price included 3,000 pounds of pepper. The story may have grown in the telling. Ransom stories usually do. But nobody at the time would have found it absurd. And that is the revealing part. Spice was money that happened to taste like something. And because supply sat at the far end of the world, the sellers could say nearly anything about it. Herodotus passed along, with a straight face he may or may not have kept, the tale that cinnamon was collected by giant birds, which built their nests of cinnamon sticks on inaccessible cliffs, and that harvesters lured the birds with heavy cuts of meat so their nests would collapse under the weight. It is nonsense, and it is marketing. Mystery justified the markup. No one haggles over the price of something gathered from the nests of giant birds. But the purest lesson the ancient drug trade has to offer is the story of a plant that no longer exists. It was called silphium, and it grew in exactly one place, a strip of dry hillside near Cyrene, a Greek city on the North African coast. Silphium was the wonder drug of the classical world. Its resin was prescribed for coughs and fevers and warts and every complaint in between. And most famously, it was the ancient world's celebrated contraceptive, which gave it the kind of demand curve no other commodity could match. Cyrene grew rich on it, so rich that the city stamped silphium on its coins, a plant with its own currency, the way another age might print an oil derrick on a banknote. It was, by weight, worth silver, and it could not be farmed. This is the detail on which the whole story turns. Silphium resisted every attempt at cultivation. It grew wild in its one home, or it did not grow at all. The Greeks knew this, the Romans knew this, and the harvesting continued anyway, year upon year. Because next year's problem is such a very old genre of problem. Grazing herds ate into the ranges. Gatherers cut without replanting because replanting didn't work, and the wild stands thinned, and the price rose, which only sharpened the incentive to cut what remained. Within a few centuries, it was gone. Pliny records, And here we should say plainly that this is the traditional telling, a single writer's anecdote polished by 2,000 years of retelling, that in his lifetime only a single stalk could be found, and that it was cut and sent as a curiosity to the Emperor Nero. Whatever the literal truth of that last stalk, the larger fact holds. The classical world's most valuable medicine was harvested to extinction, eyes open, ledgers balanced, and no one stopped. Every few years, even now, a botanist announces a surviving candidate on some remote hillside, a cousin plant that might be Silphium wearing a different name. And it is always news, because the loss still stings. The first recorded drug shortage in history has been running for 2,000 years, and it has never been resolved. Whole cities were built on this trade, literally built out of rock in the desert. Petra, the rose-red city carved into the cliffs of what is now Jordan, was the masterwork of the Nabateans, a people whose entire civilization was, in essence, a toll booth on the incense road. They knew where the water was, they knew the safe passes, and every camel load of frankincense and myrrh that crossed their territory paid for another carved column. When you see photographs of Petra's great facades glowing in the canyon light, you are looking at the profit margin on ancient medicine rendered in sandstone. The pharmacy has built some remarkable things in its time, but rarely anything so beautiful as the middleman's headquarters. And wherever prices soared, of course, fraud followed at a respectful distance. The adulteration of drugs is as old as the drug trade. Pliny and Dioscorides both catalog the tricks with the weary thoroughness of men who had been personally cheated. Resins cut with cheaper resins, precious powders stretched with flour and chalk, oils dyed to imitate rarer oils. Dioscorides, bless him, doesn't just complain. He teaches the tests, how this one should smell when burned, how that one should crumble, what true saffron does in water that false saffron won't. Reading him, you realize you are watching the birth of an entire professional instinct, the reflex of looking at a substance and asking, politely but firmly, are you really what your label says you are? The profession has never lost that reflex. It is merely upgraded from smelling the smoke to reading the certificate of analysis. A modern pharmacist hears this chapter with an uncomfortable flicker of recognition, because the supply chain never stopped being the profession's quiet vulnerability. The shelves today are stocked from the far side of the world, just as they always were. The shortages arrive without warning, just as they always did. And the person behind the counter still spends part of every week explaining that something is simply not to be had, at any price, until further notice. The jars changed. The map behind them didn't. Ingredients this precious created a problem the ancient world had to solve. Who could be trusted to handle them? To weigh out treasure by the grain, to mix it honestly, to charge for skill rather than for mystery. In Rome, the marketplace's answer was frankly, nobody in particular. And into that gap stepped the most famous medical name of the ancient world, a man who trusted no one's preparations but his own, and whose personal storeroom of remedies may have been the finest pharmacy on earth, right up until the day it burned. Rome at its height could sell you anything, including, and perhaps especially, medicine. The city's streets held a whole ecosystem of drug commerce. There were the root cutters, heirs of the Greek rhizotomoi, who brought in the raw plants. There were the drug sellers with their market stalls, the ointment makers and perfumers whose shops blurred the line between cosmetics and cures, the sellers of theriac and eye salves and amulets. Some were careful, knowledgeable people. Some would sell you colored wax and call it balm of Gilead. There was no license, no inspector, no list of approved remedies. Only reputation, rumor, and the buyer's own nerve. What the trade needed was a book, and it got one of the greatest ever written. In the 1st century, a Greek army surgeon named Dioscorides marched with the Roman legions across the Mediterranean world, and everywhere he went, he studied plants, not from other books, but from the ground up, root and leaf and habitat and harvest season. The result, his De Materia Medica, described some 600 medicinal plants and how to prepare them, which part to use, when to gather it, what it treated, how it could be adulterated, and how to catch the adulteration. It was practical, skeptical, and organized, and it held the field for 1,500 years. Well into the age of the printing press, a pharmacist's education still began with Dioscorides. Few reference books in any field have had a run like it. It is as if emergency rooms today kept a 1st century handbook within reach and found it, on the whole, still pretty useful. Rome's most organized pharmacy, though, marched with the legions. The army built proper hospitals, valetudinaria, at its great frontier forts, laid out to a standard plan with wards and courtyards, and archaeology keeps finding their supply rooms. Surgical instruments by the case, drug boxes, seals from medicine containers, and in the soil, most famously at the legionary fortress of Neuss on the Rhine, the seeds of the standard remedies themselves, henbane among them, the pharmacopoeia of empire in botanical trace. Military medicine ran on logistics, and logistics demanded exactly what the civilian marketplace lacked: standard supplies in known quantities of verified quality, delivered on schedule to the edge of the known world. If you want to see Rome's closest approach to a licensed pharmacy system, don't look in the Forum. Look in the quartermaster stores on the German frontier, where some unthanked officer counted out the army's henbane and signed for it. And then there is Galen, a man this series cannot seem to escape, because for 15 centuries nobody could. We met him in our last episode, patiently adjusting the Emperor Marcus Aurelius's nightly theriac. But Galen was not only Rome's most celebrated physician, he was its most exacting medicine maker. He did not trust the marketplace. He wrote at length about fraudulent drugs and how to detect them, and so he made his own. He gathered ingredients personally when he could, inspected them like a jeweler when he couldn't, and compounded his remedies in his own workspace: the salves, the plasters, the lozenges, the great multi-ingredient preparations, each recorded in his own hand. His recipes ran from the simple to the operatic, and one of the simplest became immortal. A blend of wax, olive oil, and rose water worked together until it cooled soft and white on the skin. the ancestor by long tradition of cold cream. Somewhere in your bathroom, there is probably a jar with a straight line of descent from Galen's bench. And Rome gives us one more first, so charming it deserves its own moment. The first trademarked medicine. On the Greek island of Lemnos, there was a particular hillside of reddish clay, terra sigillata, the sealed earth, believed since deep antiquity to be a remedy against poisons and pestilence. Once a year, on a single appointed day, with priestesses and ceremony, the clay was dug, washed, pressed into little tablets, and stamped with an official seal, the image of a goat in some eras, before being shipped across the ancient world. The seal was the entire point. Anyone can sell you red clay. Only Lemnos could sell you clay with the stamp, dug on the sacred day, guaranteed genuine by the goddess's own quality control department. It was branding, provenance, and tamper evidence in one gesture, 2,000 years before anyone printed a hologram on a pill bottle, and physicians as late as the 17th century were still prescribing sealed earths, still checking for the stamp. The active ingredient, pharmacologically speaking, was approximately nothing. The seal, on the other hand, worked beautifully, and every logo on every box in a modern pharmacy is its descendant. The profession still carries his name. For centuries, plant-based preparations, the tinctures, extracts, syrups, the made-by-hand medicines, were called galenicals, and in pharmacy schools within living memory, the art of preparing them was taught as galenical pharmacy. A Roman physician, dead 18 centuries, still had his name on the coursework when your own pharmacist's teachers were trained. Very few people get a longer shelf life than the remedies. Galen kept his treasures, rare drugs, finished preparations, years of accumulated ingredients, and his manuscripts, in a storeroom near the Sacred Way in the heart of Rome, in a district of warehouses considered the safest in the city. In the year 192, a fire tore through that district. The Temple of Peace burned, the storehouses burned, and Galen's storeroom burned with them. The drugs, the instruments, the irreplaceable ingredients, and books of his that existed in no other copy. We know how it felt, because he wrote about it. An essay on the occasion, remarkably composed, about griefs and what a person can stand to lose. The finest private pharmacy in the ancient world ended in an afternoon, and its owner responded with a meditation on not being destroyed by loss, which may be the most Roman sentence in this entire series. Here's what Rome never quite did, though. It never split the jobs. Galen prescribing and Galen compounding were the same man at the same bench, and below him the marketplace was a free-for-all. The idea that the medicine maker should be a separate, trained, examined, accountable profession, someone whose whole art is the bench, standing as a deliberate check on both the physician's pen and the merchant's scale. That idea had not been born yet. It was about to be. Not in Rome. Rome's time was ending. But far to the east, in a brand new city, built in a circle on the banks of the Tigris, where the books of the Greeks were about to be translated, tested, argued with, and improved upon. and where, in the shadow of the world's first great hospitals, someone finally opened what you and I would recognize, without any squinting at all, as a pharmacy. Chapter 4: The Golden Age of Baghdad. In the late 8th century, the new capital of the Islamic world was the most exciting city on earth. Baghdad was barely a generation old, planned and circular and booming. And it had developed an appetite unusual among empires. It wanted books. Greek medicine, Persian astronomy, Indian mathematics. The caliphs paid for translations the way other courts paid for jewels, and in the great workshops of the city, Dioscorides and Galen were rendered into Arabic, studied, and, this is the crucial part, argued with. The scholars of Baghdad did not treat the ancients as untouchable. They treated them as colleagues who were not around to defend themselves. And somewhere in that city, in the early years of the 9th century, the profession this episode has been waiting for finally appeared. Shops opened whose entire business was the preparation and sale of medicines, not spices with a sideline and remedies, not a physician's back room, but pharmacies, run by a new kind of specialist, the Arabic sources call the Saydalani. And almost immediately, the state did something Rome never thought to do. It looked at these shops, understood at once both their value and their capacity for fraud, and reached for paperwork. Pharmacists were examined and licensed. Shops were inspected. There was a public official, the muhtasib, the inspector of markets, whose duties included checking the pharmacies, testing weights and measures, examining the purity of drugs, comparing preparations against the recognized formularies, watching the prices. Written formularies were compiled precisely so that an inspector could check a preparation against a standard. Every element of the modern arrangement is suddenly there more than 1,000 years ago. The trained specialist, the license, the inspection, the reference book, the accountable counter. If you have ever wondered when the person in the white coat became answerable to something larger than their own conscience, it was here. The medicine itself grew sweeter too, in the most literal way. The Islamic world had sugar, which Europe barely knew, and its pharmacists understood immediately what sugar could do for their art. It preserves, it thickens, it carries, and it persuades. From their benches came the syrup, the julep, the rab, the lohach, the candied remedy. A whole technology of making the bitter swallowable refined far beyond the old honey and beer tricks of Egypt. You can hear that inheritance every time pharmacy opens its mouth. Syrup from the Arabic sharab, julep from the Persian for rosewater, alcohol and alkali and elixir, all Arabic. The alembic of the distillers, Arabic again. A working pharmacist today, reading a label aloud, is speaking a little Baghdad without knowing it, the way we found 2 chapters ago that a person saying melancholy is speaking fluent, humoral Underneath all of it ran a technology so quiet it is easy to miss. Paper. Baghdad had it. The craft arrived from the east, by tradition through Chinese prisoners taken at the Battle of Talas, though the truth was probably the slower, duller osmosis of trade. And Europe, for centuries yet, largely did not. Parchment is aristocratic. A single book costs a herd. Paper is democratic, and a civilization with cheap paper can afford to write down everything. The formulary in every shop, the inspector's checklist, the hospital's records, the prescription itself as a document passed from hand to hand. An ordinary slip of writing connecting physician, pharmacist, and patient, with everyone able to check everyone else. So much of what makes pharmacy pharmacy, the written standard, the auditable record, the label that outlives the conversation, is simply what medicine looks like when writing material stops being precious. Baghdad could afford its paperwork. That sentence explains more of this chapter than it has any right to. Above the shops stood the hospitals, the great Bimaristans of Baghdad and later Damascus and Cairo. Endowed institutions with wards, teaching rounds, and tellingly for us, their own dispensaries staffed by their own pharmacists. And through them moved two of the most formidable minds in medical history. Al-Razi, Raises, as Europe would later garble him, ran a Baghdad hospital and embodied its skeptical spirit. He is the physician who sat down and carefully distinguished smallpox from measles, two diseases the whole world had been content to blur together. His case notes are so honest they include his failures, which is a form of courage rarer than any remedy. And Ibn Sina, Avicenna, wrote the Canon of Medicine, the encyclopedia that would dominate medical education, east and west, for 600 years. Tucked inside it is a passage the series has been quietly building toward since Franklin's blindfolds in our last episode. A set of rules for testing a drug. Test on humans, Ibn Sina says, not only animals. Test one uncomplicated disease at a time. Note the time of action. Watch whether the effect repeats consistently. Beware confusing the drug's work with the disease's natural course. It is not a modern clinical trial, but it is a man in the 11th century writing down with perfect clarity the questions a fair test must answer. 700 years before Europe got around to blindfolding anyone. The pharmacist's quiet footnote here is simple gratitude. Every profession has a birthplace, and this is pharmacy's. The license on the wall, the standards on the shelf, the inspector at the door, the sweetened spoonful. All of it Baghdad's idea first. When the counter finally reached Europe, it arrived as an inheritance. And reach Europe it did. Slowly, through Sicily and Spain and the medical school at Salerno, in Latin translations of Arabic translations of Greek, carried into a continent of walled towns that had a genius for exactly one thing Baghdad's pharmacists lacked: organizing themselves into stubborn, jealous, magnificently self-important brotherhoods. The pharmacy was about to meet the guild, and the guild would give the shop its golden age of dragons, dried alligators, and painted jars. Chapter 5. Guilds, Grocers, and Apothecaries. The word apothecary is at its root disappointingly humble. It comes from the Greek apotheca, a storehouse, a place where things are kept. The apothecary was, literally, the storeroom man. Medieval Europe had no grander idea of him at first. He was a merchant who kept the rare and expensive things, spices, sugar, wax, dyes, and among them, drugs, and sold them across a counter like any other goods. But the storeroom man had a peculiar inventory, and peculiar inventories attract rules. Through the 13th and 14th centuries, across the cities of Europe, the apothecaries began to organize, and to be organized whether they liked it or not. Kingdoms and city councils, remembering or reinventing Baghdad's old wisdom, wrote laws. Apothecaries were to be examined, their shops inspected, their remedies made according to a recognized formulary, their partnership with physicians regulated to prevent cozy little arrangements of the kind that flourish wherever prescriptions meet commissions. And within the towns, the apothecaries did what every medieval trade did. They banded into guilds, part union, part cartel, part dinner club, part quality control board, with liveries and halls and coats of arms and an inexhaustible appetite for feuding with adjacent guilds. London's version of the feud is the best documented and the most entertaining. For generations, the London apothecaries were lumped in with the Grocers Company, the mighty guild of bulk dealers, whose very name means sellers by the gross. The apothecaries seethed inside that arrangement for a century. They considered themselves men of skill, of Latin, of art. The grocers, as the apothecaries saw it, were warehouse men who could not tell rhubarb from ruin. In 1617, King James I, persuaded in part by his own French apothecary, granted the apothecaries their divorce, a royal charter creating the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries of London. The grocers were furious, which the apothecaries appear to have found deeply satisfying. The society exists to this day in its own hall in the city of London, and for centuries, entry to the trade ran through it. An apprenticeship of 7 or 8 years, grinding and fetching and learning the Latin of labels, followed by examination before you could ever call the shop your own. And what a shop it had become. The 17th century apothecary's premises was one of the great theatrical interiors of its age. Everything about it engineered, half-consciously, to say, what happens here is rare, learned, and worth your coin. The walls held the jars, majolica and delftware, tin-glazed, blue and white and gold, each painted with its Latin abbreviation, row upon gleaming row. The drawers below held the dried world, roots, barks, seeds, flowers, each in its labeled cell. From the ceiling, in the finer establishments, hung the showpieces, a stuffed alligator, perhaps, or a blowfish, a tortoiseshell, a narwhal tusk sold and priced as unicorn horn, not for use mostly, but for atmosphere, the 17th century equivalent of diplomas on the wall. On the counter, the great brass scales, the bronze mortar, the pill tile with its brass cutter, the shelf of showstopper remedies, Theriac, of course, our old friend from Venice, still selling briskly. And in the locked cabinet, the bezoar stones and powdered mummy for customers of quality. A good apothecary's shop was a museum you could shop in, and the jars themselves were the trust. Uniform, beautiful, permanent. They said this house has standards in a language every customer could read, including the ones who couldn't read. Follow one apprentice through one day, and the whole institution comes into focus. He rises before the master, takes down the shutters, sweeps the floor of yesterday's chaff. Then the morning's grinding. There is always grinding. The mortar is the shop's heartbeat, and neighbors could tell the hour by it. He fetches water, tends the little furnace, watches the syrups so they thicken without catching. Midday, he runs deliveries across town. A basket of labeled bottles, memorizing which housekeeper pays promptly and which door has the dog. Afternoons, if the master is in a teaching humor, he learns. This root from that root, this smell meaning fresh, that smell meaning ruined, the Latin abbreviations, the prices, the regulars' ailments. Evening. Shutters up, ledger totted. One candle, and, if he is wise, an hour with the herbal before sleep. 7 or 8 years of this, and at the end of it, an examination before the Society's assembled dignity, where grave men hand him unlabeled drugs and ask him to name them, judge them, and say what they are good for. Pass, and the shop can one day be his. It was grueling, underpaid and frequently tedious, and it produced at its soot people who knew their materials the way a shepherd knows sheep. Every profession has since reinvented this arrangement and given it a new name. The residency is the apprenticeship with the candle swapped for fluorescent light. The system had its comic operas too. None better than the affair of the first London pharmacopoeia. In 1618, the College of Physicians finally issued the official book of standard remedies that all apothecaries would be legally bound to follow. It came out in May. It was riddled with errors, omissions, and half-finished entries, rushed to press, the college admitted through gritted teeth, before its time, and had to be withdrawn and replaced with a corrected edition before the year was out. The apothecaries, who were now legally subordinate to the accuracy of a book its own authors had botched, enjoyed this enormously and quietly, the way one enjoys a supervisor's typo in a memo about attention to detail. The corrected edition stood for decades. The first one became a collector's item, medicine's most authoritative misprint. 2 moments from that world are worth carrying with us. The first is from 1649, when an ex-apprentice apothecary named Nicholas Culpeper committed one of the great acts of professional treason in medical history. He translated the London Pharmacopoeia, the physician's official Latin formulary, into plain English and sold it cheap. Any literate housewife could now read what was in the remedies and make many of them herself. The College of Physicians was incandescent. One hostile pamphlet accused him of every vice available at the time. Culpeper's position was simple. Medicine conducted in a language patients cannot read is not a profession. It is a toll booth. His herbal has never been out of print since. Every plain language label, every leaflet in the bag, every pharmacist who says, "Let me explain what this one does," stands, knowingly or not, in the tradition of the angriest translator in London. The second moment is quieter and darker. In the plague year of 1665, as everyone who could afford to flee London did, including, as the apothecaries never afterward tired of pointing out, a large share of its physicians, the apothecaries, on the whole, stayed. They kept their shops open through the dying city, dispensing what they had, at the counters where anyone could reach them. That is the version the society itself tells, and eyewitness accounts largely bear it out. However you weigh the self-congratulation, the underlying pattern was real, and it has repeated in every epidemic since, down to the most recent ones. When the system strains, the most reachable person in medicine is the one behind the counter, and the counter stays open. The shop, then, had its guild, its jars, its Latin, and its pride. But the ingredients in the drawers, the actual roots and leaves, came, as often as not, from somewhere far humbler than the incense roads, from walled gardens tended in silence by people who had been growing medicine and copying the old books all along while the city squabbled. Before we cross the ocean with the shop, we owe a chapter to the garden. Chapter 6. The Monastery Garden. If the apothecary's shop was medicine's theater, the monastery garden was its greenhouse, its library, and its intensive care unit, all inside one wall, and for roughly 6 centuries of European history, it was the most reliable medical institution on the continent. The logic was written into the rule the monks lived by, the rule of Saint Benedict, the 6th century constitution of Western monasticism, is mostly a manual of prayer and humility, and who does the washing up, but it pauses to say, in so many words, that care of the sick stands before and above all other duties. Every proper monastery, therefore, had an infirmary, a brother assigned as infirmarian, and because you cannot care for the sick without medicines, and could not, in a collapsed world, buy them, a garden to grow them. We even have the blueprint. From the early 9th century survives a marvelous document called the Plan of St. Gall, an ideal monastery drawn on parchment, every building labeled, never built but endlessly studied. And there, tucked beside the physician's house in the infirmary, is a small rectangle marked Herbularius, the physic garden, with its beds drawn in and the plants themselves named. Sage, rue, rosemary, mint, fennel, roses and lilies, which were medicines as much as ornaments. 16 little beds of green pharmacy, positioned so the infirmarian could walk from a sick bed to the living medicine cabinet in under a minute. 12 centuries later, you can still read the garden like a prescription pad. What the monks grew, they also wrote. In the scriptoria, through centuries when almost nobody else in Europe was copying anything, monks copied Dioscorides, him again, and the herbals descended from him, illustrating them by hand. The plant painted in the margin, its powers listed beside it. Errors and folklore lovingly transcribed along with the truth and passed down like heirlooms. A 9th century monk of Reichenau, Walafried Strabo, even wrote a poem about his little garden, the Hortulus, going bed by bed through his sage and his horehound and his melons, praising each plant's uses, complaining warmly about his nettles. It may be the most soothing medical document ever written, and reading it feels like exactly what this channel does. Someone walking you slowly through a small, well-tended world until your breathing slows. And in the 12th century, on the Rhine, the abbess Hildegard of Bingen, composer, visionary, correspondent of popes, compiled her own great catalogue of remedies and natural lore, one of the first substantial medical works we have from a woman's hand in the European tradition. Her cures range from the sensible to the wonderfully strange, and scholars argue about every page. But the sheer authority of the enterprise is the point. Inside the wall, in an age that gave women almost no written voice anywhere else, the garden and the infirmary were hers. It must be said, in fairness to the centuries that followed, that the herbals the monks so faithfully copied preserved the nonsense right alongside the medicine, because copying, by design, preserves everything. The most famous case is the mandrake, a root that happens, sometimes, to fork into a vaguely human shape, and around which the herbals accreted one of medieval medicine's great Gothic legends, that the mandrake shrieks when pulled from the earth, and that its shriek kills the puller. The prescribed harvesting method, illustrated with perfect seriousness in manuscript after manuscript, was to loosen the root, tie it to a hungry dog, retreat to a safe distance with your ears stopped and call the dog. The dog extracts the mandrake. The shriek falls on the dog. The herbalist collects his root with a clear conscience, the ethics of this arrangement being a matter the manuscripts decline to discuss. No monk ever heard a mandrake scream, and one suspects many of them knew it, but the picture was traditional, and the pen copied what the eye was given for 600 years. It is the whole epistemology of the age in one woodcut. Reverence for the received text, even, especially, its monsters. What finally killed the mandrake's shriek was not argument. It was the habit, which the next chapters of the story will slowly build, of going out and pulling one up to check. Monastic medicine even had its own gentle institution of scheduled rest, and it is almost too perfect for this channel. Several times a year, by rule and rota, a monk would be sent for his minutio, his periodic therapeutic bloodletting. This was still the age of the humors, after all. And here's the lovely part. The days surrounding it were essentially medieval sick leave. The bled brother was excused from the night offices and the heavy labor. He rested in a warmer room. He was fed a richer diet to rebuild his strength, meat in houses where meat was rare. The records make clear that the brothers regarded their bleeding days with something suspiciously like anticipation, and abbots periodically grumbled that certain monks seemed to require the procedure remarkably often. Strip away the lancet, please, and what remains is a community that scheduled rest and feeding into its medical calendar as a matter of rule, on the theory that recovery is part of treatment. Medicine spent several subsequent centuries forgetting that, and has lately been remembering it in journals with citations. The monk's last great gift to the shop was learned from the Arabic world and perfected in the still room: distillation. Through alembics and retorts, the monasteries began to capture the spirit of things. Aqua vitae, the water of life, alcohol pulled from wine and set to work dissolving and preserving what water could not. Herbs steeped in spirit kept their powers through the winter. The tincture and the cordial were born, and the word cordial itself tells you what it was for. From cor, the heart. A cordial was a heart comforter, a prescription. And here the garden path forks, charmingly, toward the liquor cabinet. The most famous monastic elixirs outlived their medical pretensions to become after-dinner drinks. Chartreuse really is the descendant of an elixir of long life, a manuscript recipe of well over 100 herbs given to the Carthusian monks in the early 1600s, and the monks really do still make it, and the full recipe really is said to be known at any moment to only 2 or 3 of them. But this channel's fact-checking obliges a gentle footnote on its rival. Benedictine, despite the robed monk implied by every bottle, was invented in 1863 by a French wine merchant who wrapped his new liqueur in a romantic tale of a lost monastic recipe. The tale sold magnificently. It was, in the kindest possible sense, a patent medicine origin story. And after last episode, you know exactly which shelf that belongs on. Check the label. When the world outside the walls found its feet again, the garden idea walked out through the gate. The universities planted physic gardens for teaching. Padua's, from the 1540s, still grows on its original plot. And in 1673, the London apothecaries themselves laid out their own teaching garden by the Thames, the Chelsea Physic Garden, where their apprentices could finally learn plants from plants instead of from pictures. It is still there, still growing medicine behind its warm brick walls, a small green survivor of everything this episode describes. The pharmacist's beat, this chapter, is the oldest one there is. Before the pharmacy was a shop, it was a garden, and the profession has never entirely stopped smelling of it. But the garden was about to be overwhelmed, because ships were returning from a hemisphere Dioscorides never heard of. Their holds full of barks and beans and leaves that no herbal could name, including one bitter red bark that would do something no European medicine had ever honestly done before. It would actually cure a disease. Chapter 7. New World, New Drugs. Every pharmacy we have visited so far, Sumerian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Arabic, monastic, guild, worked from the same botanical deck of cards. The plants of Europe, Asia, and Africa shuffled and reshuffled for 4,000 years. In the 16th century, the deck abruptly doubled. From the Americas came a flood of species no herbal had ever listed. and the apothecaries of Europe, whatever else may be said of their age, moved fast. Within a generation or two, the New World was on the shelves. Much of it arrived, as new drugs usually do, wearing wildly oversold claims. Tobacco, and our listeners from last episode may permit themselves a small, grim smile, entered Europe as a medicine, a panacea celebrated in learned treatises, good for headaches, wounds, asthma, and in time for blowing up the recently drowned. Chocolate came through the apothecary's door as well, sold as a restorative, a digestive, a strengthener for the consumptive, argued over in humoral terms by perfectly serious physicians, while the customers, one suspects, mainly noticed that this particular prescription was delicious. Guayacum, the holy wood of the Caribbean, was boiled into decoctions and sold, at magnificent prices, through a monopoly held by the Fugger banking family, as the great cure for syphilis, which it was not. The mercury of our last episode kept that terrible franchise. New World balsams, sarsaparilla, sassafras. Each had its decade of fashion, its pamphlets, its fortunes made. But one of the new arrivals was different, and it changed the rules of the whole game. In the Andes grew a tree whose bark the local peoples knew as a remedy for shivering fevers. Spanish Jesuits in Peru learned of it in the early 1600s and began shipping the dried red bark home, cinchona, as it would eventually be named, though for a long time Europe simply called it Peruvian bark, or tellingly, Jesuits' bark. Ground to powder and choked down, it is punishingly bitter. It did something extraordinary. It stopped the intermittent fevers we now call malaria. Not soothed, not supported the body's balance. Stopped. Reliably, repeatably, specifically. Because, as chemistry would confirm 2 centuries later, the bark contains quinine, which kills the malaria parasite outright. Europe's response to this miracle was, of course, to filter it through its prejudices. The name Jesuits' bark was poison in Protestant countries. In England, plenty of respectable people would sooner shake with fever than swallow anything with a whiff of Rome about it. The story that Oliver Cromwell himself refused the popish powder as he sickened with malarial fever is probably too neat to be literally true, but it was told, widely and early, because everyone recognized the attitude, and into that gap between prejudice and cure stepped one of history's most successful quacks. Robert Talbot, an English apothecary's apprentice, devised a secret remedy for fevers, loudly warned the public against Jesuits' bark, cured King Charles II, was knighted for it, then cured the heir to the French throne, and sold his secret to the French king for a fortune on condition it stay sealed until his death. When Talbot died and the envelope was opened, the secret remedy was, of course, Jesuits' bark, rebranded, dissolved in wine, and administered with showmanship. He had been selling Europe its own refused medicine at a markup. It is hard, at this distance, not to feel a flicker of admiration. Talbot never lied about whether it worked, only about what it was, which makes him, by the standards of our last episode, very nearly an honest man. The bark's own name, meanwhile, carries a story this channel is obliged to inspect. The tree is called cinchona, after a Spanish countess, the Countess of Chinchon, wife of a viceroy of Peru, who, the famous tale runs, was cured of fever by the bark around 1630 and gratefully spread the remedy to Europe. It is a lovely story, and it decorated textbooks for 3 centuries, and it is almost certainly not true. The Viceroy's own meticulous court diary, rediscovered by historians, shows no such illness and no such cure. And the Countess in question never returned to Europe to spread anything, having died on the journey home. But Linnaeus, naming the genus a century later, believed the legend, honored the Countess, and misspelled her title while he was at it, dropping the first H. So the tree is now permanently named after a spelling error commemorating an event that didn't happen. The bark, you understand, was completely genuine. Only the label was folklore. By this point in our 2 episodes together, you could have predicted every word of that sentence. And one forward glance, because the bark's story arcs clear over the centuries. Cinchona remained so precious and the Andean supply so guarded that in the 1800s the European powers waged a long, quiet campaign of botanical espionage to get seeds out. Most consequentially, a haul obtained by an English trader named Charles Ledger from his Bolivian friend and collaborator Manuel Incra Mamani. Seeds of a strain so rich in quinine that the Dutch, who bought what London wouldn't, built from them the vast plantations of Java that came to supply most of the quinine on earth. Mamani paid for it, arrested, beaten, dead soon after. The ledger of the Ledger strain has a dark column. The world's malaria medicine spent a century growing on one island from one betrayed friendship. Supply chains, again, with everything that word hides. The deeper importance of the bark took longer to sink in, and it is the reason this chapter matters to the whole story. Humoral medicine explained disease as imbalance. One system, one theory, every illness a variation. But here was a remedy that cured one disease and did nothing much for any other. A specific, a key that fit a single lock. Quietly, over generations, that fact gnawed at the old theory. If fevers were all just imbalance, why did the bark stop only these fevers? A world with specifics in it is a world where diseases are distinct things with distinct causes, and where, somewhere, a distinct cure might exist for each. Every targeted therapy on a modern pharmacy's shelves is the descendant of that idea, and the idea rode into Europe inside a sack of bitter bark. The apothecaries, meanwhile, drew their own conclusion. The man who had the bark, and knew how to prepare it honestly, held something the physician's learning could not supply. The shelf was becoming powerful, and powerful shelves make their owners ambitious. So picture the London apothecary at the century's turn, guild-chartered, garden-trained, stocked with 2 hemispheres, veteran of the plague year, increasingly consulted directly by customers who could not afford a physician's fee and had noticed that the advice over the counter was often just as good. All that stood between him and open medical practice was a rule: the apothecary may compound and sell, but only the physician may advise and prescribe. The College of Physicians was determined to hold that line. In 1701, they found their test case, a butcher, a bill, and an apothecary named William Rose. They would have been wiser to leave the butcher alone. Chapter 8. The Apothecaries' Revolt. The case that changed medicine forever began with a sore throat and an invoice. John Seal was a London butcher. Around the turn of the 18th century, he fell ill, and he did what most Londoners of his means did. He skipped the physician, whose consultation fee could swallow a working man's week, and went straight to his local apothecary, William Rose. Rose examined him, advised him, and supplied him with medicines over many weeks, exactly as apothecaries all over the city quietly did every day. The trouble arose over the bill, which was substantial. Seal grumbled his way into the hearing of the Royal College of Physicians, and the college, which had been waiting years for a clean specimen of exactly this offense, pounced. They prosecuted Rose for practicing medicine, for advising rather than merely compounding what a physician ordered. And on the law as written, they were right, and they won. Rose and the Society of Apothecaries appealed, and in 1704 the case reached the House of Lords, which delivered one of the great pragmatic shrugs in legal history. The Lords looked at the actual medical life of England, where physicians were few, expensive, and concentrated in fashionable streets, while apothecaries stood behind reachable counters in every town, and concluded, in effect, this is how the nation is actually cared for, and outlawing it would punish the public to flatter a monopoly. The judgment was reversed. The apothecary could lawfully advise and prescribe, charging, in the polite fiction that made it all workable only for the medicines themselves, the advice being nominally free. The quarrel had been simmering in print for years before it reached the courts, and it produced, of all things, a best-selling poem. In the 1690s, the college, seeking the moral high ground, opened a charitable dispensary offering medicines to the poor at cost. A genuinely good idea that was also, everyone understood, a shot at the apothecary's trade. The apothecaries and their physician allies fought it bitterly, and in 1699 the physician poet Samuel Garth turned the whole squabble into a mock epic, The Dispensary, in which the warring healers of London are rendered as preposterous Homeric combatants doing battle amid the gallipots. It ran through edition after edition. Fashionable London read it aloud and howled. It is worth pausing on what that means. The public found a turf war between its healers funny, recognized it instantly as being about fees and dignity rather than about patients, and bought tickets. Professions imagine their boundary disputes are invisible to the laity. They are, in fact, the laity's light entertainment. It is a short ruling with a long shadow. The English general practitioner, the ordinary family doctor, seeing ordinary people at ordinary prices, descends in a straight professional line from the apothecaries the Rose case set loose. The college had sued to stop a butcher shopkeeper from playing doctor, and instead midwifed the family doctor. Few own goals in history have done so much good. But here's the part of the story that should sound familiar by now, because this series keeps finding the same pattern, and it never stops being quietly funny. The apothecaries, having won the right to doctor, began to doctor. They visited patients, kept consulting rooms, charged, eventually, openly, for attendance. And as they rose into medicine, they left the counter behind them. Whereupon a new trade slid in at street level to do the compounding and selling they were now too grand for. The newcomers called themselves chemists and druggists. The apothecaries turned doctors regarded these upstart shopkeepers with precisely the suspicion the physicians had once aimed at them: unexamined, unregulated, mere tradesmen, and the whole cycle wound up for another turn. It took until 1841 for the chemists and druggists to band together in their own body. The Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain, with its own examinations, register, and school. And that society, not the ennobled apothecaries, is the direct ancestor of the British pharmacist. The profession, in other words, has been reborn at the bottom of the same staircase twice, and both times it climbed. One begins to suspect the staircase is the profession. Across the Atlantic, the story ran looser and faster because America had no colleges, no charters, and no patience. The colonial apothecary was whatever the town needed: druggist, doctor, wholesaler, tinker. Medicine and pharmacy blurred at every frontier crossroads. But as the young republic's cities grew, the American pharmacists did a very American thing. Rather than petition a king for a charter, they founded a school. In 1821, the druggists of Philadelphia, stung in part by a proposal that physicians should inspect and grade them, organized the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy, the first in the nation, with lectures, a library, and examinations of their own making. Self-invented, self-policed, and defiantly independent. The American pharmacy had found its character, and in the next chapter we will walk into its finest creation, a shop unlike any the world had seen, with a marble counter, a bubbling fountain, and a glowing globe of colored water in the window whose meaning nobody now alive can tell you for certain. Chapter 9. The Corner Drugstore. Every civilization in this episode built the pharmacy it deserved. Baghdad built the licensed dispensary, London built the guild shop with the alligator on the ceiling, and 19th century America built the corner drugstore, which was a pharmacy, a laboratory, a soda fountain, a post office in a pinch, a newsstand, a courtship venue, and the town's living room, all under one pressed tin ceiling. Begin at the window with the drugstore's great unsolved mystery, the show globe. For the better part of 2 centuries, the sign of an American pharmacy was a hanging or pedestal globe of glass filled with brilliantly colored water, ruby, emerald, sapphire, glowing like a jewel with a lamp behind it. Every pharmacist displayed one, and nobody, truly nobody, knows where the custom came from. The theories are a little museum of everything this series has taught you to recognize, that it descends from the alchemist's vessels, that it advertised to the illiterate, that the colors were changed to warn travelers of plague in town. Each theory repeated in 100 old trade journals, none with evidence worth the name. The honest answer is the one this channel owes you. It is a beloved tradition of unknown origin, and the profession kept it precisely because it was beautiful and everyone recognized it. Some labels, it turns out, can't be checked. The show globe hangs on in pharmacy logos and museum windows, a soft glowing monument to the limits of fact-checking, and we say that with affection. Inside, on one side, stood the prescription counter, the serious side. Behind it, the 19th century American pharmacist practiced compounding at its historical peak. Powders weighed on hand scales and folded, dose by dose, into neat paper packets. Pills rolled by hand from a kneaded mass, cut on a brass pill machine, rounded between wooden paddles. Tinctures percolating. Ointments worked on marble slabs. Every step done by eye and hand against the standards of the United States Pharmacopoeia, itself a young marvel, first issued in 1820 by a national convention that decided American medicine should at least agree on what laudanum meant from Boston to New Orleans. An ordinary corner druggist of 1880 performed, before lunch, more small batch manufacturing than most modern pharmacists will do in a career. And on the other side, bless it, stood the fountain. Our returning listeners already know this story from the patent medicine chapter of our first episode. Carbonated water began as a therapy. The druggist was its natural dispenser, and the phosphates and tonics and nerve remedies of the fountain slowly shed their medical pretensions and became simply delicious. By the early 20th century, the soda fountain was the drugstore's social engine, the after-school seat, the first date seat, the marble bar where the town digested its news. When a young Chicago druggist named Charles Walgreen wanted to grow his shops, one of his most effective weapons was, of all things, the malted milkshake his fountain made famous. The empire that today fills America's corners was built substantially on ice cream, which is, you must admit, a very sleepy history sort of fact. The same counters carried the era's shame, too, and honesty requires the shelf check. The patent medicines of our last episode, the soothing syrups, the tonics, the miracle bottles, sold nowhere more briskly than in drugstores, and the war over them split the profession. The ethical druggists, as they pointedly called themselves, fought for a pharmacy of disclosed formulas and honest labels, and in the long run, through the 1906 Act you already know, and the slow rise of the prescription-only line, they won. The drugstore's respectability was not inherited. It was argued into existence, shelf by shelf. Two fixtures of the old drugstore deserve a closing inventory, because both say something true. The first is the poison book, The 19th century druggist sold, quite legally, arsenic for rats, laudanum for sleep, strychnine for vermin. And the era's answer to the obvious problem was a ledger. The purchaser signed for the poison, name and address and stated purpose, with the druggist as witness. It was a thin defense, and every Victorian murder trial featuring a signature in a poison register proves both that it existed and that it leaked. But look at the shape of it. The controlled substance, the record of sale, the professional standing between the public and the dangerous shelf, exercising judgment about who signs. The modern pharmacist logging a controlled prescription into a state monitoring database is keeping the same book with better handwriting. The second fixture is the night bell. Set into the door frame of countless drugstores was a bell that rang in the room where the druggist slept, because medicine does not keep business hours. The croup arrives at 2 a.m, and the drugstore was, for most towns, the whole after-hours medical system. Generations of pharmacists came downstairs in dressing gowns to compound in the small hours for frightened parents. The all-night pharmacy, the on-call rotation, the 24-hour store on the interstate. All descendants of a bell wired from the shop door to the bedside, and of the professional assumption underneath it, if it rings, you answer. What held it all together was the figure behind the prescription counter, open early, open late, reachable without appointment or fee, the one credentialed person in the neighborhood you could consult by simply walking in. Immigrant neighborhoods especially ran on the druggist, who spoke the old language and knew every family's ailments. Surveys in our own century still find the pharmacist among the most accessible and most trusted professionals in American life, and the reason was built right here, in the era of the show Globe. Trust compounds, like interest, one small, honest interaction at a time. But even as the corner drugstore glowed its brightest, the ground under it was shifting. The pills were about to stop being rolled at the counter, because a century earlier in the back room of a small German pharmacy, a very young man with a mortar, a set of borrowed chemical glassware, and no formal education to warn him it was impossible, had done something that would eventually move the making of medicines out of the shop entirely and into the factory. Chapter 10. From Shop Bench to Laboratory. Chapter 10. From Shop Bench to Laboratory. Approximately 14 minutes. Friedrich Serturner was a pharmacist's assistant in Westphalia. 21 years old, curious, stubborn, and bothered by a problem every pharmacist of his age knew intimately. Opium was not reliable. One batch was strong, the next weak. The sleep it gave and the danger it carried varied jar to jar. The learned consensus held that a plant's power was a property of the whole plant, diffuse and inseparable. Serturner, who had not been to university and so did not know how settled the question was, wondered whether opium's sleep might instead live in some single, separable thing, one ingredient among the gums and resins, doing all the work. Working after hours with bench glassware, he dissolved, precipitated, filtered, and recrystallized. And around 1804 he had it. Pale crystals that carried, gram for gram, the whole soporific soul of opium. He fed them to stray dogs. Then, in the era's cheerful tradition of self-experiment, to himself and 3 young friends, in doses we would now describe as alarming, and confirmed the crystal's power more thoroughly than intended. He named the substance for Morpheus, the god of dreams. Morphium. Morphine. It was the first time in human history that anyone had isolated the pure active principle of a medicinal plant, the exact molecule, out of the ancient vegetable haystack that did the thing. It is hard to overstate what that opened. If opium's power was a molecule, everything's power might be. Within a generation, the alkaloids fell like dominoes, and note who was catching them. Quinine, teased out of our old friend the Peruvian bark in 1820 by Pelletier and Caventou. Both pharmacists, caffeine, codeine, atropine, strychnine, nearly all of it benchwork by pharmacy-trained hands. Dosing could finally be exact, not a grain of good opium, God willing, but a measured milligram of a known substance. 4,000 years of approximately ended in a few decades. The pharmacists had, quite literally, found the needle in their own haystack. And then the shop itself began to transform. In Darmstadt, Germany, the Merck family had run the Angel Pharmacy since the 1600s, a fine old shop of exactly the kind this episode has furnished, jars and all. When the alkaloid revolution arrived, Heinrich Emanuel Merck made a decision of enormous consequence. Rather than prepare morphine batch by batch for his own counter, he would manufacture it, pure and standardized, in quantity for other pharmacies. A back room becoming a factory, the factory becoming, in time, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies on earth. The pattern repeated everywhere. Squibb built a firm on reliably pure ether. Eli Lilly, a pharmacist, put his name over a laboratory door in Indianapolis. And in London, 2 American-trained pharmacists named Silas Burroughs and Henry Wellcome built a company on the precision-made, compressed tablet. That second name should ring a small, pleasant bell. Henry. Wellcome poured his fortune into collecting the entire visual history of medicine, and nearly every engraving, painting, and photograph you have watched drift past on your screen tonight, and last episode too, comes from his collection. The pictures of the old pharmacy were paid for by the new one. This channel is, in a modest way, downstream of a pharmacist's tablet press. Aspirin. The Willow's gift, whose long road we walked in episode 1, arrived from Bayer's factory in 1899 as the emblem of the new age. Identical white tablets by the million, no mortar required. Decade by decade through the 20th century, the compounding bench yielded to the manufactured shelf. The pharmacist's hands left the pill mass and took up, instead, the label, the ledger, and the question. The new profession opened one door, quietly, sooner than most, to women. Pharmacy in the later 1800s became one of the first credentialed health professions a woman could realistically enter. The schools began admitting women decades before most medical schools would seriously consider it, and the shop itself had always been a family enterprise in which wives and daughters kept the books, minded the counter, and knew the stock as well as anyone. The first women graduated from American pharmacy colleges in the 1880s. By the early 20th century, the woman pharmacist, while never yet common, was no longer a curiosity. Today, the profession that spent 4,000 years as a fraternity graduates classes that are mostly women, and has for decades one of the quietest and most complete demographic transformations in all of medicine, achieved without a single dramatic chapter, one license at a time. It seems fitting for this profession in particular. No revolution, no proclamation, just the steady arithmetic of examinations passed. The 20th century, it must be said, also spent a few decades trying to shrink the job. As manufactured tablets replaced compounding, a caricature took hold. The pharmacist as mere counter of pills, count, pour, lick, and stick, licensed far beyond the work's demands. The profession's answer, gathering force from mid-century on, was the clinical pharmacy movement. Push the pharmacist back toward the patient, reviewing whole medication regimens, advising prescribers, managing dosing in hospitals, counseling at the counter as a duty rather than a courtesy. The doctorate became the standard degree. The white coat moved on to hospital wards and into clinic corridors. It was, in effect, the Rose case run in reverse. The counter, reclaiming the advisory role it had been quietly exercising since Baghdad, and it is the professional world your own pharmacist trained into. Which brings us, at last, back around to the modern counter, and to what the person behind it actually does, since the pills come made now is the beginning of the answer, not the end. The compounding is mostly gone. The checking has never mattered more. The modern pharmacist stands at the one point in the system where everything converges. Every prescriber's orders, every specialist's additions, the whole medicine cabinet of a human life, and reads it as a single text, watching for the pair of drugs that quarrel. The dose that fits the chart but not the kidneys, the duplication two busy offices never noticed. It is quiet work. Its victories are invisible, because a caught error is an event that never happens. Baghdad's inspectors would recognize it instantly. The license, the standards, the accountable counter, the profession's oldest job, done with newer tools. And on the license on the wall, in state after state and country after country, there is still, after 4,000 years, a mortar and pestle. Take something hard and make it something a person can swallow. The tools changed. The sentence never did. And that is the whole walk. 4,000 years, one room. If you're still awake, look back the way we came. The clay tablet with no doses, trusting its reader. The Chi-Fi smoke rising in an Egyptian dusk. The word pharmacon, holding cure and poison in the same 4 syllables. The silphium coins of a city that spent its miracle. Galen's storeroom and Galen's composure. Baghdad's licenses and syrups. The painted jars of London, the alligator on the ceiling, the angriest translator in England, the monastery beds of sage and rue, the bitter bark that actually worked, a butcher's bill that invented the family doctor, the glow of the show globe, origin unknown, and honestly so, and a 21-year-old assistant, after closing, finding the exact crystal where 4 millennia of sleep had been hiding all along. The shop is still open. It has never once closed in all that time. Someone, somewhere, has always been standing at that bench between the hard world and the human body, grinding one into a form the other can bear. Tomorrow, if you need it, there will be a counter near you with a person behind it who knows your name. That is not a small thing to have built. It took everyone in tonight's story to build it. Thank you for spending this night with the sleepy history of medicine. If these long, quiet histories help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe for the next one. The shelves of this old shop are nowhere near empty. But there's no hurry about that, or about anything. The lamp is low, the door is locked, the jars can keep till morning, and so can everything else. Sleep well.